wouldn't call them sort of disciplinary approaches, but that to a certain extent is what they are. It's sort of, in a sense, the biological base of agriculture, but as well the farmer behavior component, which is absolutely essential to how that biological system is organized and managed. So agriculture has always been a function of the biological and the socioeconomic. But in sort of the organization of agriculture research, particularly sort of in the early period in which we're going to be discussing, there was no social science, no agricultural and economics within the RF programs in Mexico or in Colombia. The experience in colonial Africa and Asia was similar. It was all biological research in the centers. But the Hardin, or the Roberts-Hardin paper, and this I think comes more from Lowell Hardin than from Roberts, i.e. more from the Ford Foundation side than the Rockefeller Foundation side, was very adamant that social science, but in this particular case, agricultural economics, would be a critical part of the interdisciplinary research that would be carried out in CIAT. So these three distinguished colleagues sort of were some of the first in order to sort of explore that issue, i.e., what is the role of agricultural economics in this case? And we'll get a little bit more into the other social sciences a bit later. What is the role of agricultural economists in sort of essentially a biological sort of research institute? How do they integrate with biological scientists? And what was that experience in the early stages of the development of the center, in terms of achieving that? So I'll start with Per because he was the first. There was actually a Canadian economist that was here at the beginning, but left quite early. So I look to these three as really the sort of the core economics program within CIAT at that stage. We'll turn it over to three of them for sort of initial reflections of 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'll start to sort of shoot them some questions, and then if there's any burning questions from the audience, I'll take some of those. Okay, so Per.
Thank you very much, John. So we agreed that I would focus on some personal reflections from the first few years of CIAT's existence. I was interviewed for a job at CIAT in 1968, and I joined right out of graduate school in the beginning of 1969. I was on an extremely steep learning curve, not with regard to economics, but with regard to how does a brand new PhD in economics contribute to the development of a brand new agricultural research institute that is totally dominated by biological science. Where do you fit in? I was the second one to be hired directly into CIAT. Of course, a number of science staff were transferred from the Rockefeller Foundation program in Colombia. Eduardo Alvarez Luna was the first direct hire. He became the deputy director at CIAT. So I was there from the very beginning. I spent 7 years at CIAT, the best 7 years from a professional perspective that I've ever had. That kind of set the stage for what I did the rest of my professional career. So I'm deeply grateful to Jerry Grant for taking the risk with a brand new PhD in a program that wasn't known for its let's say, economics activities. So what was the perceived role of economists at CIAT at that time? It was totally unclear. I met with Jerry Grant soon after I joined, and Jerry said, look, I'm not sure what you should be doing, but make sure you get mud on your boots. He actually used a different term with more related to livestock, but I should leave that unnamed. He said, you are not here to produce referee journal articles. That is not your job. You are here to be an integral part of an effort to increase food production in Latin America. He was very, very clear on that. He also frequently during the 7 years I was here referred, or during the time that he actually left before I did, but during the time he was here, to refer to football teams. He talked a lot about football, and he said, we should operate as a football team. We should work together. So yes, it is true that that CIAT didn't create these integrated commodity programs until later when a new director came in. Jerry had that in mind all the time, but the implementation of it probably didn't really happen. But he was, now he never told me who was the quarterback, but he did tell me who the coach was. That was clearly him, and he really wanted us to work together in a multidisciplinary team without creating the multidisciplinary team. And as John pointed out, Jerry Trant, a Canadian economist, was stationed at the Universidad del Valle as part of the Rockefeller Foundation program, and he was to be transferred to CIAT as well, and that did happen formally, but in fact he left very soon after I came, so he really never really became fully integrated in the CIAT activities. So here I was, head of an economics program that consisted of one person, so I was also the tail. That is not quite true because I was working with a group of really outstanding research assistants, all of whom, as I recall, were Colombians, and we worked together as a team. Then 2 or 3 years later, we were very fortunate that Alberto and Grant joined as well. So then we had a real program with at least 3 international scientific hires. That didn't last for very long, as John said. Soon we were split up and we were assigned to various commodity programs, and we will talk about that a little later. But coming back to, so I was assigned to cassava and beans, and Alberto and Grant can talk about their own assignment. But I want to stress that in the beginning, many of the agricultural scientists and some of the leadership really didn't see a need for economics. I mean, yeah, Lowell Harden said you had to have economics, so we're going to have economics. But without the Ford Foundation and Lowell Harden's pushing, it isn't entirely clear that there would have been economics from the very beginning. Now, notwithstanding, though, that Erie had had economics input for quite some time before that, Vern Rutan had been in Erie and left, and Randy Barker was there. There was an economist at CIMMET as well, so it wasn't as though we were breaking new grounds. So, in order to get credibility, and I'm now, I believe, in the cassava program, James. James and I talked about how we could make that happen. Now, I was a little, I wasn't very happy with the fact that I needed to show that I could get mud on my boots, because I had worked for 6 years as a farm worker in Denmark before going to the university. So I had an awful lot of mud and other things on my boots. Probably much more than many of the agricultural scientists, but that, of course, I didn't mention. So James and I agreed that I would show that I could grow a crop of cassava right here on the experiment station, right here in headquarters, and I did, until James felt that I had proven myself and he took it over. Now, of course, field workers are doing all the work, so it isn't that big a deal. You were just kind of putting your name to it, but we managed, James, and you then kind of said, that's good enough. You can now go back and do your economics work. What should that be? What should this economist do? Because there was some question again whether you were really needed or not. So I decided, in collaboration with our colleagues, of course, at CIAT, that the best thing I could do with the research assistants I worked with was to do some ex-ante assessment of what kind of research would give the biggest bang for the buck, so to speak. And here we were talking about productivity increases. That's what we were talking about at the time. So I started, together with my colleagues, the research assistants, we started collecting data from farmers' fields, observations on biotic and abiotic stresses in farmers' fields. We interviewed farmers. We tried to get information back from the farms into the research community to kind of break the rule that I had seen in other places, that the research priorities by new PhDs getting jobs in research community was to continue doing the research they had done for the PhD dissertation, ignoring pretty much what the problems were out there in the real world. That's an exaggeration, but there was a little bit of that. So by strengthening this communication back into the researchers, we thought that it would make the research more relevant. So with that data, I would then sit down with my colleagues in agricultural sciences and say, now, I have identified these 2, 3, 4, 5 biotic or abiotic problems out there in farmers' fields. What's the probability that you can solve these problems? And we talked about this. And what's the kind of time that you think it's going to take? Now, this is going to be very subjective, but it's a lot better than nothing. I then did some magic and some econometrics, and I came up with what I thought the priorities should be. Did that have an impact on CIAT's priorities? I don't think so. And there was a particular reason for that. All of this data collection happened in Colombia, yet CIAT was an international organization. So I think the impact, if any, and I'm going to ask James a little later to comment on that because we talked about it yesterday, and he could see it from a program director's perspective. I think the main impact of that was to show a way of getting the information back from where the intended beneficiaries were experiencing their problems to the researchers. So it was more of an illustration of a model of an approach, I think, than actually having an empirical impact on what CIAT was doing. That's the way I see it, and I'm trying to be very modest about this because I think there's a reason for being modest in this particular case. But I still think it was a very useful concept. It was done at Erie as well, although I don't think it was done at CIMMET at the time. My next idea was, well, why don't we take a look at how we can change research priorities for the benefit of nutrition? Because I had read a number of proposals that started out by saying, give me money to do agricultural research because we have some big nutrition problems out there. People are starving. And then I kept reading these proposals, and they never came back to saying how they were going to do that, what they were proposing was really going to help nutrition. So I thought, well, why don't we see if we can put some meat on those bones? So we started collecting data on that. Now, I should mention that at that time, nutrition was calorie and protein intake. We didn't talk about micronutrients. We didn't talk about obesity. We didn't talk about food security as a measure of access to food at the household level, the definition that we've been using for a number of years now. At that time, food security, and John mentioned the term earlier this morning, food security was the availability, the total availability of food, whether it was produced or imported. It was not related to access, and therefore it wasn't really that closely related to nutrition, because you can produce an immense amount of food without having any serious effect on nutrition. In fact, you can have a strong negative effect, as we now know. That got me into a feasibility study of the high-quality protein maize that had been developed by CIMMET. And for those of you who are not familiar with what that is, it's basically a maize variety that contains the essential amino acids that are missing in regular corn or regular maize. It had been shown that it was very effective in swine, used as feed for pigs. Jim Maynor, who was the head of the swine program in the Rockefeller Foundation, therefore at CIAT, had shown, he had some beautiful, beautiful picture that showed a little pig that got regular maize and a big pig that got this high-quality protein maize, and they were same age, but the big one was a lot happier than the smaller one. And so we figured, or some people figured, that could be applied to humans as well, because clearly there was a lack of basic amino acids in the diets of human beings. It turned out not to be true, but we didn't know that at the time. So I did a feasibility study. I went to consumers with 2 bags of rice, or of maize, I'm sorry, regular maize and the high-quality protein maize, and I said, tomorrow you should cook with this, and the next day you cook with that. I'm going to be back in 3 or 4 days and see which one you like the most. I've talked to farmers about producing one or the other, talked to traders, and so on. Just without going into a lot of detail on that, because all the details are in CIAT's first research report number 1, that has all the details. The outcome of that, the conclusion of that was that high-quality protein maize would be dead on arrival. It just wouldn't go. The only place where it would be preferred was among the rats, because it was a soft kernel. The consumers didn't know how to use it. The farmers didn't want to grow it. The yields were too low, and it was a soft kernel. And there were a number of other reasons which I can't go into now. Why am I mentioning that? Because 3 days before I presented these results at a conference in Bogota, the President of the Republic was on television saying that high-quality protein maize is the best thing that ever happened. All maize should be produced using that variety, and we should all consume that. And so here you are with a bit of a conflict between what the highest level policymaker is saying and what this lowly Danish researcher is saying. So sure enough, Jerry Grant got a call the next day saying this Danish researcher probably shouldn't stay much longer in Colombia. Jerry supported me, he protected me, and he said, if there's anything wrong with the guy's research, we will retract it and we do it. But if there isn't anything wrong, he stays. And I stayed. I'm mentioning that just to show that I was on a very steep learning curve. They didn't teach me at Cornell, at Oklahoma State University, how to deal with a situation where the president said one thing and my evidence said something else. One of the reasons why it was very effective in the production of pigs was that we didn't have to worry nearly as much about behavior. And one of the things, of course, I found in the work I did with humans was that behavior kind of got in the way. Yes, it really was nutritionally better for you, but there were all kinds of behavioral reasons why it wouldn't go anywhere. So did all of that nutrition, agriculture, research priority in nutrition, did it have any impact on anything? Probably not, because it was very premature. We did have a conference with all of the centers that existed at the time participating. That was in Addis, where we talked about this, and a book came out of it. I wrote a bunch of papers. But in fact, there was no real response to this. That just wasn't the time to do it. The only response came from the World Bank that had just hired Alan Berg as a person. He had written the Nutrition Factor, a very famous nutrition policy book. And the World Bank hired him to promote nutrition within the bank. He got interested in this because he thought he could use that to promote a greater impact on nutrition in project development at the bank. And also Marty Foreman at USAID was very interested. So there may have been some impact in those two institutions, but within the CGIAR, there was really no impact. Now compare that to what has happened the last 5 or 6 years. Everybody is now talking about changing the food system for better nutrition. But at that time, it just wasn't the time. And the point here, of course, is that timing is very important. I could go on with all of these, but I think John would like me to be quiet for a little while. So let me do that.
Right.
Thank you for listening.
Or to give your colleagues a chance.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Let me focus on three broad issues. The first is the question that John asked us initially to say, with hindsight, what was the role of economists in CIAT at the time. I joined CIAT in '73, and I left CIAT at the end of '76 to join IFPRI, to start a program of trade and food security. My impression when I joined, Per had been there before, was that as economists we were sort of searching for our place in CIAT. It was not a clear, well-defined role. When I met Jim Grant, he said, it's very similar to what he said to you, but said, do some cost of production. Fine, and I think that one of the dilemmas was sort of and they assigned me to primarily to the beef program, which was going through a major transformation. So this was before the final decision to move into the savannas, So there were big questions of the beef program, which were very interesting. There was still some work on the North Coast, and then the savanna question. They also assigned me some time to the swine program. And there were one of the difficulties for me was sort of to accept the role of as a service unit, in an interdisciplinary group, very limited, cost of production, if you wish, for some, versus, in addition, the possibility of addressing technical change in a broader context, In Latin America in the 70s, was a very tense situation in the politics, in the ideology. You see, the ideology at the time, we had Alain Jean-Brie here, in a seminar. I said, no, you guys have very little to do, This is a question of the center and the periphery, and sort of technology in this center is not going to have much impact. So we were trying to understand, the internal potential possibilities of IFPRI, but also trying to be responsive to the external environment. And for me, it was much broader than just simply technology. Technology in this new context of highly charged political, ideological will. On legitimacy and credentials, my experience was very different. With team members, I would like to think that it went quite well. My work with Jim Spain, with Paladines, Bert Groff, Wells was very easy. My program directors were sort of different. I think I got the impression that someone, perhaps Ford, had pressed, get an economist, but there was not real enthusiasm, what to do with these guys, So you had to muddle through. Things changed a lot for me when John Nichol came. That really was another world, and much more interesting. And also at the time we didn't have emails, we didn't have internet, so we were rather isolated, and isolated from the broad community of economists in Latin America, which we wanted to reach. And also, in the particular case of beef program, the question of Cerrado versus the Llanos, Embrapa was developing, you see, so the situation was very ambiguous, is CIAT going to be the big push there, or really going to be Embrapa, a collaboration of both? That whole thing was very different. Let me move to totally different aspects, two observations, two issues which I think were very important, which were not somehow addressed extensively yesterday. We heard about the dramatic structural transformation that has taken place in Latin America. Martín Piñero mentioned that, Julio Verdeguer. which is right, you know. The 70s and today is another world, you know. And this structural transformation had a major impact in so many things, you know. Well, among other things, agriculture's share in the economy rapidly declining, population agriculture rapidly declining, you know. The integration of agriculture with the rest of the economy, integration of agriculture with the rest of the world, you know. The impact on agricultural growth, if we compare, you know, before 1990s or after, you know, is a very rapid change. And what I would like to raise as a hypothesis, a question, well, but what was behind that dramatic structural transformation taking place in these countries in that time? And I have very perhaps biased view. I think was essentially the economic policy reforms after 1980s, which happened in many countries. What kind of reforms? These were not agricultural reforms. These were not sort of farm bill reforms. The essence, in my view, was economy-wide reforms. We changed the whole structure of incentives, the whole question of mobility of factors, etc. And essentially, for me, were macroeconomic reforms, times of very high rates of inflation. You know, I was coming from a country with 400% inflation a year. Do some cost of production with that, you know, good luck. So macroeconomic stabilization and exchange rate policy, which will really reflect the true price of tradable goods. You know. Second, deregulation was a time of price controls, marketing boards, state monopolies on products, on fertilizer, etc., etc. So the government was highly involved in running, in a sense, the economy, which today is done by the private sector. Third, very important, trade liberalization, opening the economy, you know. We were sort of, since the 40s, 50s, many of these countries had followed an import substitution policy, inward looking, you know, essentially with the promotion of industrial and the manufacturing sector. So I think that was extraordinarily important for agriculture because, you see, the agriculture, the result of the exchange rate policy, you know, with the import substitution policy was a strong anti-export bias for agriculture, you know, relative to investment in other sectors. If we think of the economy, you know, agriculture, tradable, non-tradable, we took of manufacturing, tradable, non-tradable, and home goods with large services, large investors, you know, entrepreneurs, you know, could go to the sectors which were protected, you know, and so they would, agriculture was sort of left a bit. And the fourth element of these economic reforms was privatization. So macroeconomic stabilization, exchange rate, including exchange rate, deregulation, privatization, and trade liberalization. This changed completely the scenario in which agriculture was working. See, and then the discovery of public goods. Rockefeller's Ford Foundation had discovered that there was a public good, but as a discipline of economics, looking at the public goods, you know, where you have externalities, positive and negative, of course. So, you see, the returns to this effort by the CGIAR system was going to condition by this external environment, you know. And my hypothesis is that the external environment was really taxing agriculture, so the potential return was going to be much lower than what you would get in a more sort of reform scenario. And I think that the outcomes of the reforms, you know, were very strong. The sector did much better in terms of growth after the reforms, see. But I think ultimately more important perhaps, the effect on welfare. You see, the increase in household income that we observed during those last sort of 20, 30 years, you know. Now, to what extent this can be attributed to agricultural research, you know, new technology, to what extent it's the result of a much broader package of reforms. Personally, I would think that the latter is the essence. It was economic growth that promoted this improvement in welfare, which is reflected, in education, in health indicators, life expectancy, you name it, access to infrastructure. And so that shock came at least after I left CIAT. I began to work on that at IFPRI. And this program, I should say that the effect on welfare is also complemented by national programs focused on nutrition and health, targeted to low-income families, rural and non-rural. So they were very important, and Per did a lot of work on that. So the other element also was that as a question, what happened with productivity? You see, in economics, in terms of the jargon, if you accept it, we think of the total factor productivity question. It's not just land productivity. A lot of the focus on the CGE was on land productivity, on yields. Fine, you need that. But that's not enough, If you're expanding production by adding more labor, more capital, more input, etc., you are not going to get very far in the long run, you see. So I think that one of the essential questions was what has been sort of the impact of that economic reforms and on total factor productivity. And I think it's a very critical question for Ruben, because you talk about sort of sustainable growth. Well, I think part of the essence of that is sustainability, is essentially total factor productivity. What the evidence tells us, mix, likely to be that with the reforms, if you think of a graph, productivity was growing, sort of a jump during, I think, the initial periods of economic reforms, but then continues on a trend. It's sort of a once and for all impact, So one of the challenges, how could you get another jump, What would be the ingredient for another jump so that you get back to that trend, more rapid growth. So you need, of course, you need technology, but technology in the atmosphere that we were working at the time, I think that was likely to have a relatively small impact compared to its potential. Its potential came afterwards. And also transformation show us the diversification that took place in agriculture, so that we move out. You see, the obsession with self-sufficiency in food was so strong. How about, non-food products, Well, a lot of the economic transformation has been in some countries towards non-food products, So today, with the diversification that's taking place, with the opportunities in world markets, you see, if you were looking at the domestic market, except for Brazil, Mexico, this was relatively small economies, so that you had very severe limitations on the market opportunities compared to today exporting to China, which is the darling of the exporters. So the change has been so dramatic. So just some reflection to try and understand sort of some of the forces behind this change. Thank you.
No, I'm not going to limit you, but then maybe just one or two questions. One question from the audience. Okay.
Oh, good morning. The last time I was on this platform was to run staff meetings when the audience consisted of a bunch of very presumptuous and bold scientists who asked a hell of a lot of awkward questions. I hope the audience today will be a little kinder. First of all, I'd like to very much thank Ruben and CIAT for the invitation for Veronica and I to come from New Zealand. New Zealand's a long way away. Actually, we're not a long way away. You guys are a long way away. And we have close relations with Latin America. In particular, this weekend, we're expecting New Zealand to beat Peru in the World Cup elimination. I'd also like to congratulate Ruben and all the staff on the effort that's gone into this event. Almost 20 years ago to the day, not quite, a couple of weeks off, we had the 30th anniversary of CIAT. And as the Director General at that point, I think I can speak with some authority about the amount of effort and time and planning and thought that has to go into running something like this. So I very much recognise what's gone on and congratulate you. I have mentioned to the board chairman a proposal that the impact assessment unit should calculate the rate of return to the investment in this event because my sense is that it'll be very high. Before I say anything further, I really would like to recognise two very special people. They were my predecessors. The first of those was Gustavo Norris. Gustavo was a very, very dear friend and colleague. I remember going hiking in the Gigantes of Córdoba with Gustavo up to the refugio that his grandfather built, I think. And one little story that I always recall is that we were visiting Colombia when Gustavo was here, and we had dinner at his house. He had he lived in Hacienda Menga, a lovely old property on the edge of Cali. And my daughter was about 6 years old at the time. And with all the innocence of a 6-year-old child, she sort of, as we were sitting at dinner with Gustavo's family, I think there were 7 children, and all the innocence of this little child, in a loud sort of stage whisper that everyone could hear, she said to me, "Papi, Gustavo es un hombre grande. Papi, Gustavo tiene manos grandes. Papi, tiene una familia grande. Tiene perros muy grandes. La casa es muy grande." She'd never seen anything on this scale before. He was un hombre grande, and it's just very sad that he's not here today. And the other person I want to recognise is Bob Havner. And I think it's a great sadness that Bob's not with us today too. With all due respects to our current colleague, he was the best board chair that one could have ever had. So I did really want to recognise both Gustavo and Bob. You've asked us to look back, and I have a couple of challenges in that. First of all, I arrived in CIAT in 1973. We saw these wonderful photos yesterday of all the staff groups, and I swear 80% of them weren't born in 1973. They just looked so young. I reckon the average age was about 17. But looking back, 1973 is a long time ago, so I guess my memory isn't maybe all as good as it should be on things, and we see things a bit differently from that perspective. And secondly, I had another period at CIAT in a different role, and it's a bit hard to separate the two, because when I think about CIAT, much of my recollection, of course, is dominated by the challenges we faced and the things we did at a later period. So it's a bit difficult the lines are a bit blurred. But let me just organise a few comments around a very simple idea, a simple framework. You know, you go to these management courses and they teach you about communication, and the test of a good presentation is can the people in the audience remember one thing you said a day later? So I want you to remember the word incentives, because I think an enormous amount of what we have to think about hinges, whether it's talking about farmer behaviour or scientist behaviour or how we organise research, a lot of it has to do, a huge amount of it has to do with the incentive structure. Stephen Landsberg, a Cornell economist, said that economics is about incentives. All the rest is commentary. So if we think about incentives, then we can think about a sort of sequence, and I'm going to give you an enormously simplified little structure, which sort of says that, okay, what you start with is a sort of governance arrangement, and then from that you develop a structure. That structure shapes the incentives, and the incentives shape the behaviour. And so I think we can think of it, and then there needs to be some feedback that James was referring to this morning in this sort of accountability. By the way, when we first came to Colombia, Veronica was talking to Fernando Chaparro, and because she was teaching at Valle and wanted the Spanish word for accountability, and Fernando rocked back in his chair and laughed, and he said, "Veronica, we don't even have the concept, let alone the word for it," in Spanish. So there has to be the feedback loop. And that's not to diminish the role, to put too much emphasis on the structure and incentives and diminish the role of sort of the social capital and team interaction, which was brought out in a very wonderful paper by Jackie Ashby, reflecting on the role of social science in CIAT. And she makes the point very strongly that those interpersonal relations are very important. So let me use the simple model just to illustrate a couple of experiences in CIAT. There's been reference to the original Director General, Dr. Jerry Grant, and my experience was that when at the end of a week-long period of interview for the job at CIAT, I was given an audience with Jerry Grant, who was a very distinguished scientist and had probably forgotten more about Colombian agriculture than I would ever know. And he said to me, well, he said, I never really saw much point in having economists. I don't really know what use they can be, but they tell me you're a fairly sensible sort of a fellow, so I guess we'll make you an offer. So that was the sort of, so why do I recount that? Because I think it really reflected the environment that we were coming into, that the governance and the leadership wasn't exactly committed to the role of economics or social sciences more generally. He again sort of stressed, as we've heard this morning, that CIAT was a place populated by agricultural scientists, at that point populated by a large group of the Rockefeller people, and they were there to do good science, and economists were just sort of some sort of appendage that had been foisted on them. So what's the role of economics? Well, Vern Rutan, I think the first economist in the International Centre System, once said that in thinking about research, there are many, many, many interesting questions. Some of those questions are important, and some of those are doable. And so I think one of the roles that economists can play, and we tried to play here, was in this question of resource allocation, the priority setting. How are you going to sort of apply that filter down and make sure that we're offering the scientists alternative research options that would have different sorts of payoffs, and those payoffs could be in terms of yields, they could be in terms of income distribution, or nutrition. But it was again to sort of, in a sense, provide incentives through that information about priority setting. A second area that I thought that came out of those early work was at least some recognition of the policy context. What was going on in terms of how policies were impinging and creating incentives at the farm level. It was all very well to be at the farm level, but unless you understood how that policy environment was affecting things, then you probably weren't going to get very far. And we did a lot of work on a land settlement area in Guatemala, where the government wanted this to be a success. They wanted the productivity to go up. They wanted these farmers to prosper. And they introduced a supervised credit program. And the supervised credit program gave them credit at very subsidised levels, but there were a few strings attached. You know, you had to put some fertiliser on, and you had to use this seed, and you had to do that, and you had to do the other thing in order to get the subsidised credit. Well, to cut a long story short, incentives matter. And what did the farmers do? Yes, they bought into the program, and how much fertiliser did they put on? An amount equal to the value of the subsidised credit. And that was it. They took advantage of the scheme, but they really didn't modify the farming system at all. It was merely the farmers responding to the policy, but the policy hadn't been thought through to a point where it really was going to make a difference. A third area is where the economists work was in the evaluation of impact. This again, I would argue, was important from an incentive point of view in terms of getting the donors to invest. There was a considerable element of consternation amongst the board and I think amongst some of the donors that the rice program was focusing on the irrigated sector. And this was ignoring some other parts of the rice sector, and particularly small farmers. And so there was a big push. In fact, there were discussions about whether CIAT should continue to work on rice or whether it should change its whole focus away from that. Well, we did some work, and here I want to acknowledge a very dear friend and colleague, Colombian colleague, Rafael Posada. We did some work on looking at the contribution of rice research. And the two punchlines of that were, one, it had had a very big payoff, but secondly, the benefits of that rice research were in large part, and I say very large part, not captured by the large farmers. They were captured by the poor urban consumers in the barrios of Bogotá, where rice was a very significant part of the total budget. And so the enormous increase in rice production in Colombia had the effect of lowering the real price of rice very significantly, and in effect, creating a real income gain for low-income consumers. So that brought the focus onto the outcomes, not just the output of the rice program, which was higher yields, but onto the outcomes. And I would like to believe that the continued effort in rice was at least part stimulated by the recognition that there were wider consequences, wider social benefits. And I think economists think that. Final comment before the chairman throws something at me. I'm the only person here, I think, who was actually a member of the infamous Small Farm Systems program. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments on that, and I want to tell you why it failed. It failed on my 4 dimensions. It failed on governance because there was a lack of support and commitment. It failed on the structure. It was located outside the 4 commodity empires, each with their own dictator, to go along and say, hola, I'm from the Small Farm Systems program and I'm here to coordinate you, was never particularly well received. It failed on the incentives because the commodity programs and their presumptuous and bold leaders had very little incentive to work with this bunch of odd people. And it failed because there was a complete lack of Jackie Ashby's social capital amongst the team. The team of an anthropologist and an economist and a systems engineer and an agronomist all went their own separate ways. There was never, ever an element of teamwork in it. So it failed on all those 4 dimensions. Why do I mention a failure? Because I think we can learn from it. In the words of Abraham Lincoln in the opening sentence of his speech to the Republican Convention in Springfield, Illinois, he said, if we could first know from whence we have come and whither we are tending, we would better know what to do and how to do it. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I just wanted to conclude with an observation that I'm sure Ruben will be particularly interested in. I've got the data here if you need it. This is a little bit of empirical research that I did for this presentation, and that is that the average life expectancy of a Director General at CIAT is 68.75 years. The bad news about that is I must be on borrowed time, so I just warn you to be careful, mate.
Okay, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We're well past sort of our allotted time. But thank you very much to the sort of what I can say are the three original economists who went on to, I can also say, much greater things. But some very nice lessons learned. And a couple I draw out from discussions yesterday. Demand-led, farmer demand. How do we measure it? And, you know, in terms of PAIR, really, how does it influence then research? So it's not just a matter of being sort of demand-led, but there's a whole set of steps and processes by which we really think about, you know, how to characterize farmer demand and then how to relate that to the research process. And that's conditioned as well by the point on you have to understand the policy environment as well. And that gets a little bit into what we now call sort of foresight. So some interesting lessons coming out of those first experiences. And, you know, I think some of the sort of the young scientists that sort of enter into this type of work, don't necessarily have to feel so lost and unconnected. It's a process which we all go through. So thank you very much, and turn it over to the moderator.